In an earlier session today, we spoke about the destruction of Juukan Gorge, and that was now 2 years ago. So since then, has the way companies engage with First Nations people improved? Is the progress legislatively matched by action on the ground? And what are the next steps towards genuine, constructive relationships with First Nations people and protection of cultural heritage and human rights? Our panel today is Topaz McAuliffe, the CEO of 15 Times Better, which is 100% owned and led by Indigenous women. The business specialises in First Nations strategy and program development, evaluation and execution. They help Australian organisations align Indigenous engagement with their core purposes, unlocking opportunities that deliver increased social and economic outcomes for First Nations peoples. Dr Melissa Mcewen is the First Assistant Secretary, Environment Protection Reform in the Australian Department of Agriculture, Water and the Environment. Her area is responsible for reforms to environmental legislation and the administration and reform of Indigenous cultural heritage legislation. And Colin Johnston is the Manager, Indigenous Engagement Western Australia for BHP. He joined BHP in 2011 and working within its global Indigenous and community engagement team, Colin maintains a focus on BHP's national Indigenous engagement and native title landscape. Moderating this final session today is Adam Davids, the co-founder and CEO of First Nations Equity Partners. Adam's a proud Aboriginal man and descendant of the Wiradjuri people. He's a non-executive director at Social Ventures Australia, a Fulbright Scholar and a Kenneth Myer Innovation Fellow. First Nations Equity Partners is launching the First Nations Australian Equity Fund this year. It'll invest only in ASX 200 and aims to provide investors with direct and scalable impact by driving reconciliation and the self-determination of First Nations Australians. Please make them all welcome.
Thank you. When I was given the brief, I wasn't told I'd be following the amazing Lee and all the great moderating that took place this morning. It'd be remiss of me if I didn't just give some acknowledgement to ACSI and appreciate that this is the final session of today. The acknowledgement for ACSI, I think, is due in that their advocacy on First Nations issues has been super encouraging. We know that First Nations inequality is the longest standing moral issue facing the nation, and we all have a responsibility to address it. So can I please just get us to give a round of applause for ACSI for giving a voice to this issue. We've got an awesome conversation ahead, and my plan really is to extract some thinking from our panellists around the current state of affairs. What role can corporations, investors and governments play? In a few moments, I'll invite each panellist to introduce themselves and their broad views on this subject. Thanks so much for the introduction. I can cut half of some of my other notes down, but I specifically, as a Fulbright Scholar, produced a framework that quantifies the performance of ASX 200 companies, looking at the full spectrum of their people, purchasing and philanthropic capability, and how well those activities align to the aspirations of First Nations people. And as we know, Indigenous Australians are underrepresented in a number of arenas. That includes the finance and investment and share ownership sector. And the fund that we're launching later this year, I don't believe that there are any other listed equity funds that are dedicated to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander impact. And in terms of the issues that I'm focused on, which is really subject to the discourse that we'll have on the panel, what we know is that as it stands present, there is only one Indigenous Australian sitting on the board of an ASX 200 company, or 0.0002% of all directors. As of the latest census that was undertaken, Indigenous Australians earn just 67 cents to every dollar earned by all Australians. That we're not seeing companies undertake racial pay audits, and only 24% of ASX 200 companies are reported to have a reconciliation action plan in place. We hear of research like Indigenous workers are 3 times less likely to refer their Indigenous family members to work in their organisations, and we've seen in recent years companies fall short in their agreement-making process and their stakeholder engagement with communities. My belief is that companies can and want to do better. Having been a pioneer of an organisation called Career Trackers, I've seen the private sector lead in areas where the government has traditionally struggled. However, today we're seeing governments commit to some of the boldest reform in our generation on First Nations issues. We have more Indigenous members of Parliament than ever. And as ESG trends emerge, it's becoming increasingly clear that the expectations of organisations are to be more committed to Indigenous Australians. And I can just see into the future, in the day that we have the referendum, company after company changing their Facebook profiles to support the yes vote in the referendum. The ultimate question will become, are those organisations exhibiting the values and the Voice Treaty Truth proposal that the community really is calling for? It'd be remiss also if I said that there has been a lot of progress made to date, but the challenge that I would really pose to the room and to the panel is what does it look like for businesses to be authentic, to be innovative, to be strategic with their engagement with First Nations Australians, assuming that we want to be leading this and not just following government and doing the bare minimum and ticking the box as proposed by what any policy might require. Let me end by saying that let's get clear on the standards, and we'll talk a little bit about that in this conversation. What does good look like? What are the pitfalls that we've got to avoid? Thankfully, we've got an incredible panel whose minds we're going to pick on to talk about this a little bit further. And look, with that being said, I will get the panel to introduce themselves. And Topaz, we might start with you. If you could just introduce yourself and just share us some of your opening thoughts.
Yeah, hi everybody. Thanks for having us today. So my background is only ever been implementing Indigenous affairs inside of corporates. So the past decade, 12 years now, is actually working with Wesfarmers and Coles Group, which is like having 100 companies under one roof. But what that taught me is actually, in order for something to be sustainable, any social impact change, there's got to be a really clear return on investment. And so in my experience, the conversation at the moment is definitely shifting, where people want to do the right thing. They want to understand how to do it better. But a lot of people are still looking at Indigenous affairs as a charitable cause or something that's good to do, which that's great. But it's great for business if you get it right. And so one of the things that we work on is actually there is no one size fits all. Kind of your guiding principles, how you approach it is pretty similar. But actually what you tailor it to and the best contribution your company can make is actually only what your company can do. And sometimes we look outwards for some of the information, but a lot of times you probably need to start inwards as a starting point because you know your business better than anyone, or the companies do. So yeah, so my background's very much about activation, practical, tangible. Doesn't sound that exciting, but it's about scalable change as well. So
yeah. Colin Johnston, and thank you again for your interest and for having me here today, and to echo Adam's comments earlier, to ACSI for their ongoing engagement in this issue. This comes on the back of many conversations that put together, and it's been a privilege to be a part of some of those. For my part, as was already introduced, I work for BHP, and I can't quite believe it, but it's been some 11 years now that I've done so. And when I reflect on how quickly that time has gone, it's probably reflects how quickly times have changed and how dynamic the industry is. I'm based in Western Australia, where I've been for most of that time, and throughout that time I've held roles in and around Indigenous engagement, agreement making, cultural heritage management. They're passions of mine and things we'll no doubt get to talk a bit about later. Prior to joining BHP, I had related roles with the WA government, and prior to that with the Northern Territory government, looking at similar issues.
Hi, I'm Melissa Mcewen. I work for it's now changed to be the Department of Climate Change, Energy, Environment and Water. Shows how quickly your bio can become out of date. I've just spent actually the last 7 or so weeks working in Minister Plibersek's office, helping through the transition into government and setting some of those new policy agendas, and in particular the launch of the State of the Environment report last week. In my normal job in the department, one of the things that we are doing in this area at the moment, which I think there's only one other area of government that's doing something similar, but that is trying to work in a genuine kind of co-design partnership way to look at how we can reform protections for First Nations heritage. And it's a really exciting piece of work, not without its challenges, by working in co-design is in itself a challenging opportunity, but also an enormously rewarding one. So happy to talk about that a bit more later.
Yes, and I'm going to make you all wait for that update to the back end of our discussion. Colin, I wanted to start with you. And when we spoke before the conference, you were talking about how influential certain moments in Australia's history had been, such as the historic Aboriginal land rights movement, and really keen on your perspective about what have been some of the historic or even recent events that you think has created this sense of responsibility or even urgency among companies to improve their engagement with First Nations people, and specifically, what do you think have been some of the practices that companies have done to improve since those moments?
Yeah, look, I'm conscious you've given me a fair amount of leeway there, so I'm going to have to ask you to nudge me in the direction of the things that are more interesting and away from the things that aren't. But, I mean, clearly one of the things that I have to reflect on is the advent of native title. And while it seems like a long time ago, 30 years, in many ways it's not. So that high water mark decision of Mabo No. 2, which established this radical new concept of common law property rights, and a Native Title Act that followed closely in 1994. I mean, the change that brought about was profound, and probably initially, I'm pleased to say it was before my time, but no doubt carried an amount of fear and uncertainty. And in fact, what it's given rise to is a platform for agreement making, for relationship building, for benefit sharing. And while it is a long time, its progression, continues to this day. There are still native title determinations that are yet to be unresolved, many of which have only been resolved in very recent times. So the landscape continues to settle. And, so too do the agreements that have been reached with reference to the Native Title Act continue to evolve. I mean, I can reflect on roughly 3 generations of agreement making, from those initial ones to our second generation agreements to those that we're trying to advance at this point in time. So definitely native title and land rights has been fundamental to the relationship between companies like BHP, resource companies, and to many other sections of the community as well. Related to that is, of course, heritage protections. And in the opening comments, it was the events of Juukan Gorge were very much identified as a key moment in our nation's consciousness and our understanding of some of these issues. And with due reverence to those events, it has enlivened a greater interest, a depth of understanding, and, as you say, an increase in practice that is marked. Some of those improvements are simple, they're technological, they're the way that companies in their information systems, in their databases, can improve their management and understanding of heritage values. They're attitudinal. The interest of senior leadership was always high, but it's higher than it's ever been before, and the role that they're continuing to play in decision making on these topics continues to be a significant change. Also, we have to reflect on constitutional reform, which is so closely related to so many aspects of Indigenous circumstance in this country. And if you were to look for events, perhaps none more profound than that constitutional convention at Uluru in 2017 and the movement that's given rise to, and the opportunity for organisations like ours to lend support to that movement where that support is invited and sought.
If I can nudge you a little further, and love to get other perspectives from the panel on this topic. Earlier today, we heard from Deanne at Aware, who talked about moving from targets to action. And I think if we can sort of pick out a little bit of the practices and the action that you feel like, and please reference any of the activities and policies and practices of BHP. I know in the Indigenous community there's a lot of encouragement with the kind of policies and practices that are being seen. So can you share us like specifically in terms of actions and practices that you feel like are notable that you've seen in the industry or even in BHP?
Yeah, I guess the intersections between companies like ours and Indigenous Australia are multifaceted. You know, they cover each dimension from cultural heritage management, agreement making, employment, procurement, and targets are really important in businesses like ours. We are a company of engineers, and people are very good at having targets to focus on and to perform against. In and of themselves, they won't deliver the change you're looking for on their own, but in concert with, surrounding attitudes and endeavours, they will. So, I mean, in terms of Indigenous employment, all companies largely are is an accumulation of the people within them, and we're very lucky that over 8% of our people are Indigenous. And so in a company that employs some 25,000 people, over 2,000 of those people are Indigenous. And that happens through a deep commitment within an organisation to try and make a workplace that will attract and can retain Indigenous talent. That takes effort. Procurement as well. I could speak ad nauseum about this, but the change that supporting Indigenous business makes is profound. It's not disputed that Indigenous business leads on the attraction, retention and development of Indigenous people. So when you support Indigenous people through their businesses, it makes a profound change. And having targets and redoubling your commitment to Indigenous procurement can make a massive change.
I was going to reflect on both the question of what can be a prompt and some of the things that we've done. In terms of the release last week of the State of the Environment report, this was the first time that the report had Indigenous co-authors in every chapter. And I was fortunate enough this week to get to meet some of those authors, and as they were briefing Ministers Plibersek and Burney. And it's really interesting the value and integration of Indigenous knowledge and science, and the cooperation and different approaches where you learn to bring a different perspective into what you're doing. And for me, it's one of the really valuable things out of the State of the Environment report. It also does tell a really sad story for our First Nations people. It does show ongoing decline, ongoing destruction of cultural heritage, ongoing social and economic indicators going further downhill. And so I'm hoping that also can be seen as another prompt for us to think a bit more about how we move forward. I mean, similarly, the Closing the Gap report that came out this week, again, not showing a great deal of improvement across many areas. And so we need to redouble our commitment in those areas, I think, quite critically.
Yeah. So if we take, there has been lots of progress, and Colin, you talked about supplier diversity and employment, and Topaz, keen to come to you on this one. Like, thinking about the progress that we've made, even despite that, one of the things that often keeps coming back up is that there's a lack of First Nations representation in corporate leadership. On a global stage, we do hear conflicting views around what is the root cause issue of that, and I'll highlight one example. In 2020, the CEO of Wells Fargo in the US said, reported by Forbes, that the company's lack of diversity stems from a limited pool of black talent to recruit from. In Australia and overseas, we see more and more research that suggests that there's perhaps greater systemic issues that create barriers for underrepresented groups to progress. But from your perspective, Topaz, what do you think your company can do to demonstrate how to increase the voice of Indigenous Australians in their companies?
Yeah, so I always talk about this in numbers, in that we're only 3.2% of the population, and probably half of that are in working age as well. So it's not something that we're able to do by ourselves. And the idea that in the next couple of years you'd have an Indigenous executive at every company, the timing of it's not there. But it's actually about embedding the principles across your company so that everybody understands kind of what it is that you want to be acting and behaving in a particular way. And so even looking at things like the United Nations UNDRIP, they call it, which is actually about the Declaration of Rights of Indigenous People. So there's global templates out there, but it's actually what I think I see in Australia and with a lot of the people that we work with, is that they're not sure how to tailor this to suit their own organisation, so there isn't a one-size-fits-all. And so the idea that everybody is going to do the same thing and focus on the same outcome, in the last 6 months, the overwhelming amount of companies who are wanting to try and do Indigenous employment, so there isn't enough in Australia at the moment. There's a labour shortage in general. But it's actually flipping it and going, well, what is it that you're trying to solve as an organisation? So is actually Indigenous employment an issue that your organisation should be playing a really leading role in? Or is there something else that you could be doing which makes more sense? And so I think we often get caught up in that one-dimensional, we must give jobs or we must give supplier opportunities, but there's other ways that you can actually contribute. And I always link it back to what's the core purpose of the company, and anything you do should really align to that. And so in terms of getting voices, we do have to get better at actually building that pipeline of executives to come through. But right now, at every layer of your business, the decision-making should have that lens over it. And I don't want to sound contentious, but everything that happened with Juukan Gorge was avoidable if you'd have just followed those processes. And it is a risk mitigation piece of work. But it can't be led by individuals in the company. So you can't have a passionate director or CEO. It's actually got to be organisational wide and embedded. So regardless of what restructures happen, acquisitions take place, people leave, it's actually embedded as if you would embed anything else across your organisation that's good for business or is about risk mitigation.
And can you talk about the experience that you had in the tremendous success in building Coles Indigenous employment programs and thinking about developing the pipeline? Really interested in your perspective to share with the group about what should investors and companies really be looking for in terms of the pitfalls. How do we know, what good looks like? How should we observe that? Yeah,
so this is an interesting topic at the moment, and a lot of companies, and you're talking about reconciliation action plans, there's a bit of confusion around what that actually is. So from the words of RA, reconciliation action plans are about reconciling, whereas companies jump straight to the output. And so they actually don't neatly plug into each other. But what they talk about is you've got to build the foundations for reconciliation to then be great at whatever it is you choose to do as an organisation. And so the Coles story, where we went from 65 people to 5,000 people, and in that time probably saw 10 or 15,000 people, it made sense for Coles to do that because they had 30,000 jobs a year. And there was also issues in remote locations with high turnover of staff. So it was actually solving an issue for the company, which ultimately then made us a better organisation. And I don't work for Coles anymore, so just speaking on that experience. But it actually then became great for the company because in remote locations or just a competitive advantage, people were choosing to then come and shop at Coles. And prior to that, it was, well, if you don't have Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people working for you, they're definitely not shopping with you. So it's actually making some of those links. And I think if you look at some of the large organisations, everybody just assumes employment is what you're best at. But we actually look at an organisation first in terms of how you're operating. So if you've got challenges in retaining people in general, like the warehousing industry at the moment, it won't matter what you do in the employment space right now because of the culture of the industry. So it's actually just about understanding that. And I think a lot of that knowledge is actually people have that, the companies themselves, it's asking the right questions. But I just dig that little bit deeper and not just assume what you hear is accurate. One of the things that we do, and we're doing a bit of stuff with IFM, who are, I think, taking the right approach around actually how do they get a better understanding of where they're at as a company and also some of the activities that they're doing. But it's actually doing it in a way that it's just about you as an organisation. It's not necessarily about everybody else's benchmarking. So your success, and you talked about KPIs, like what's the evidence around how you've built that KPI, or if you just plucked a target out because someone suggested that's what you do. So again, I think it's just taking back that step back again and realising, is it the right thing for your organisation? And there is absolutely something that every company can be doing in this space.
Yeah. And if I can pick on something that you said in your opening comments, and would love to get other panellists to talk on this as well, you talked about this charitable mindset that often gets applied to Indigenous issues, and I see that as well, right? Like you sort of go in and the response of a company when you bring up an Indigenous-related item, it's, oh, that's our social thing, that's our corporate responsibility thing, or that's talk to our foundation. What is it that you're suggesting in terms of the shift? Well, like, okay, if we're going to move from this charitable mindset, what are we shifting it to? Is it a risk-based mindset? Is it a commercial-based mindset? Is it strategic? How would you characterise that, and where do we go?
So I'd say it's all three, but where you get the most success and innovation is that strategic alignment. So there are absolutely bare minimum things that you need to do, which is about mitigating risk, and that's talking about those kind of guiding principles within your own organisation. But where the magic actually happens is when you overlay that with strategy and understanding, well, how can we actually leverage the work that we're doing? It is, the outcome's always amazing for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, but actually how do you make the outcome amazing for your organisation? And that's when you start to see some of the really exciting, innovative things happen.
I think there's a social licence issue for companies as well. It's not necessarily about charity. I mean, I've worked now in environment and Indigenous for a little while, but before that I was in live animal exports, in the regulation thereof, not actually doing it myself or exporting, but where, you know, this question of what is it that consumers and the public are going to accept in a company's behaviour. And I think Rio Tinto discovered pretty quickly that that kind of wanton destruction is not something that investors, the public or anyone are willing to accept. And for me, something that I think companies need to be increasingly aware of in the Indigenous space, but also in environmental and others, is that the appetite has changed. And I think the election results demonstrate that. You know, most people in the public care about the environment now. They care about how we're impacting on First Nations people. We need that. It would be a foolish company that ignored those kinds of risks.
To that point about the transition from a charitable mindset to a strategic mindset, I couldn't agree more. I mean, we've for a long time said we don't have, they're not stakeholders, they're rights holders. Things like native title agreements aren't exercises in social redress. They are dealing with a property right at law. Same with dealings with rights in relation to heritage. It is very much an imperative, and it's not a nice to have. And your approach to doing that, I mean, I think to Topaz's point about all the well-intentioned bright ideas in the world will not outcompete a good co-designed initiative that was properly arrived at with relevant Indigenous peoples themselves making decisions around how something is best done.
Such a perfect lead into the next topic, which is, I think, what a lot of folks in the room have been waiting to hear more about from you, Melissa.
No pressure.
Talk to us about, like, what outcomes should we expect to see from the government's consultation on cultural heritage? Perhaps you could start by just giving us the current landscape. Tell us about the landscape and around legislative frameworks for cultural heritage, and perhaps you could share what some of the outcomes will be around the consultation and what next.
So the landscape at the moment, it's very, it's a really challenging space. We've had a range of different reports and reviews that have all underlined the fact that we don't do cultural heritage management, particularly First Nations cultural heritage management well in the country on a broad scale. There are patches of good practice, but overall, in the Samuel Review on the Environment Protection Biodiversity Conservation Act pointed to the fact that there are a range of committees that are constituted under that Act, The only one that doesn't have a really determinative role or a particular role is the Indigenous Advisory Committee. It's there if the minister wants to ask it for something, for some form of advice, but it doesn't have a specific role. Many of the consultation processes under legislation are fairly lip service type approaches, which don't really go to proper, deeply thought through agreements, and it's good when companies have started to do that on its own. In fact, native title legislation probably gives a lot more rights than any of the cultural heritage protection legislation that there is. And so post Juukan Gorge, we had the work that was undertaken by the Joint Standing Committee in Parliament that looked at the current, what happened in the actual incident, but also the broader landscape, and made a range of recommendations about how that can be improved. It is, of course, a very complex area because a large amount of our cultural heritage legislation is at the state level, and the piece of legislation that is currently at a federal level, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Heritage Protection Act, was passed in 1984 and has had almost no changes to it. And if you think to big pivots in the way we deal with land, that was before many of the land rights issues, let alone native title. So this has become, so it's very out of date in the way that it is written, but also it's not particularly effective in the way that it's communicated. So the work that we've been doing with the First Nations Heritage Protection Alliance, I think I'm not going to predict exactly where we're going to land because I'll get myself into trouble if I do that too much. But one of the things that's been really important for me as a member of the government is being able to listen to our partners in this and being able to have really frank conversations with the Alliance. We have a joint working group that I jointly chair with Rachel Perkins, and we have lots of conversations. And it's very interesting, as a bureaucrat, it can be quite challenging working with a group who are in many ways activists, because there are some real tensions in the way that we want to approach things. But so far we've spent a lot of time building trust, and that's one of the things that I think is going to be vital to solving law reform in this area, is about trust. At the moment, I don't think that most First Nations people have much trust in the cultural heritage laws that are out there. And even the changes that happened in Western Australia were most recently in response to Juukan were still quite widely criticised by First Nations people. So there is now a process, which I think you're involved with, around developing some of the legislation underneath that. And it'll be really interesting to see how that goes. But we've had an initial round of conversations with people out there. I think that we do have a sense that there is a desire for there to be a bit more unanimity in the legislation. That makes it easier for business if they're dealing with the same kinds of rules broadly wherever they are in Australia. But it also gives a bit more confidence. We've got to be very careful that in trying to make things aligned, we're not going to the lowest common denominator, because that's always your challenge when you try to bring everyone along. But earlier this year, there was a meeting of both Commonwealth and state officials where there seemed actually from the states quite a lot of goodwill about potentially some leadership from the Commonwealth in terms of what heritage protection looks like. Over the next few weeks or month or so, we're going to be working together with the Alliance to develop a paper that will have probably a range of options, and then we'll have a good consultation process after that. Because again, we want to listen, we want to have good conversations, we want to get out to communities and ask them what they think about the approach of the legislation and what we're doing going forward.
One of the things that I think we see in the investment sector is this sort of top-down versus bottom-up approach of a red flag issue gets raised and then we sort of react and try to address the issue. And on that notion, thinking about the legislative reform, what could you comment on in terms of, is it more about regulating against destruction or boosting and preserving cultural heritage?
Yeah, so I think that was a very telling quote in the Juukan Gorge inquiry, was that currently most First Nations heritage protection is about issuing licences for destruction. And when you think of it in that those terms, it's a bit depressing, really. So I think what we need to do is, one of the things that I do currently is manage the operations of the Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander Heritage Protection Act now, and it was designed as a piece of legislation of last resort, and you can only make a declaration if something is at imminent risk of threat. At the point that is really too late for everyone. It's too late for the people whose cultural heritage is now being debated. It's too late for the companies who are involved often, because they have a massive investment usually, and we're talking the week before they are starting to dig, that we're being asked to have the minister make a decision as to whether to stop a project. So there's enormous stakes involved in that. And I think what we need to do in part of this review, and this is a personal view rather than necessarily a party line, but is how do we do more at the beginning? How do we put more investment into identifying what needs to be protected and making sure that it is protected, rather than making it something that happens at the end, where often what you do see is that people are given the licence for destruction.
Yep. We've got a really great question that's come online, and rather than just sort of let it be a question that is about the legislative reform, I'm also keen, Colin and Topaz, after Melissa answers it from a legislation perspective, where you feel like companies can incorporate a co-design process in their own policy developments. So the question reads, how do we ensure that co-design overcomes the skewed power balance between government, companies and First Nations groups? Melissa?
Look, that's been something that we've tried to work very hard on, and it's hard because ultimately legislation has to be agreed by a cabinet and passed by a parliament. But up to that point, we are trying to make sure that we are keeping the leadership of the First Nations Heritage Protection Alliance and the Minister at kind of the same level of engagement and consultation. So I think it's being part of the answer is being very aware of that dynamic and having it in your mind, because if you forget that it's there, it's really easy to just gloss over it. And so it's been great that our partners have pulled us up a few times and said, yeah, but if this is a partnership, then we both need to have that say. You know, a minister can't just have a final call or veto something in a discussion paper if the First Nations Heritage Protection Alliance doesn't have the same right. So I think it's about making that really conscious and being really conscious of those decisions when you work through co-design.
Yeah, I think it's also the identification of the right stakeholders for the consultation as well, and that co-design element. And so often you'll be part of a process, or a company will go out and find the most well-known or closest kind of 1 degree Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander person that's got a profile. But actually, are they the right person to be supporting you on a co-design process? Because it's actually got to be about a shared goal or a mutual benefit. And so you want someone who actually understands where you're coming from. And therefore, I think it's actually taking more time to be more deliberate around identifying the right stakeholders for that, or else you're going to get people who are going to give you, really generic guiding principles, but it's actually not what you're after. True co-design is they really understand where you're coming from and you're understanding where they're coming from and you're working towards that together. So I think too often we see that happen, and just going through a process at the moment as well around that power imbalance. Often those in power don't actually know that they have that and the impact of that on the individual. So it's also that when you're going into the process, being a bit more vulnerable and building that trust. But I mean, look, there's a long way to go. I think we haven't actually probably chipped away at that at all, and maybe some changes that's going on. We might start to see that a little bit more, but yeah, I think it's just companies, I've noticed them just be a little bit more vulnerable going, we just got this wrong, but we really want to fix it. And so I think there's been a few triggers where people are now actually approaching it differently as well.
Yeah, for sure. We might take some questions from the room. There's a question down here, the roving mic's on its way.
One thing I think while that's happening, I'll just add, it was interesting, I was listening to Graham Samuel speak on Tuesday, and he did say, we have to be careful that some people will choose one Indigenous person to represent the, many, many nations that are across the country, and that awareness that one First Nations person isn't representative of every First Nations person is something that we really got to critically think about in government and business and companies.
Yeah, if that understanding of the plurality of Indigenous circumstance and identity is one that really needs to increase.
Yeah. Right.
You guys keep going, it's all good. Thank you. Chris Newton from Yamba Baru Yaru. So I'm a director of an Indigenous organisation in Broome, representing the Yaru people of traditional owners. Topaz, thank you for clarifying co-design principles right there. Colin, you probably know this, that co-design should have people in the same room at the same time, but as you know, the Western Australian government is failing to do that at the moment. Let's just put that aside. That was not my question, but thank you. As a statement. I was interested, you were talking about the beginning part about the percentage of population and the talent pool, etc., 3%. I wanted to flip that a little bit because it's an issue about capacity. There is not enough capacity to fill the pipeline that's needed, the demand. What can companies, or what are some signals that companies can do, let's say, for the other 97%? Because I think there's a capability gap there around First Nations issues. Share some experiences or stories, or what are some insights for us when we're sitting in a room as an investor as well? What is good performance from that? Because not every company is blessed in the sense that they can have 8% of their workforce to have First Nations people.
Yeah.
Finance, hard.
Yeah, I think, sorry, I'll just jump in on that one. I think I'll take it back to what's the purpose that you're actually having the conversation around Indigenous employment, and is your organisation best placed to make the greatest impact in that particular way? And, if you just look at the organisations where you might have a lot of the consulting firms or legal firms, a lot of those roles are skilled roles. And so the idea that you could double or triple the representation, that's a really long way to go for that particular industry. But if you're looking at an organisation that has volume, entry level, it makes sense for you to invest your time and effort because you'll get the return on that. So I think it goes back to A, why are you looking at it, and B, is that where you should be putting all your effort? And I'll use an example of, we did a review for a company where it was going to cost about $750,000 for them to set up Indigenous employment. This is the other thing too, it's actually costly to set these programs up. And a lot of the time, no money or resources are ever linked to it. So it's just added onto everyone's day job and you're expected to go and deliver. But what we flipped it and said, well, that's going to give you 35 jobs a year. Could you do more with that $750,000, potentially support 200 businesses within your supply chain? So I always link it back to that element. Where we do have the opportunity to create employment, it is about building that pipeline. So if you're not an organisation right now that can give jobs, how do you actually go back to primary school and actually create awareness to your industry that you actually want people attracted? So one of the things you'll look at in a lot of regional schools, and Australia as well, just in certain industries, it's not really widely known what jobs come with certain companies. So unless you've got family that's gone to uni, you've worked and that you've got some visibility for some reason, the knowledge isn't actually shared at a school level. And so I think we actually need to get better at educating. There's conversations around having more Indigenous people in the health sector. There is a great amount of people coming through in terms of doctors, but it's all the other areas. It's the pharmacy, it's anything linked into that. A lot of people just don't know that they're out there. But your job is to raise awareness, but also then to create the opportunity to have a pathway as well. So sometimes it's not just the job, it's actually what else can you be doing.
From what I heard, sorry if I may, yeah, I think you're entirely right. I think, you need to focus on that 3%, but you need to focus on that 97% as well. And you need to build the cultural competence of 97% of your workforce, or whatever that number ends up being, if you're going to affect that change. You also need that mindset. I mean, I think a long time ago we realised you need a maturity around your pipeline, and it's not everyone wants to work for your organisation. And we adopted an approach whereby we want to support people to pursue their talents wherever they would like to. If that's with us, then brilliant, we're especially happy. But if it's pursuing their passion somewhere else, then we're big believers in that, and we support that through our social investment approaches as well. In that way, I do think a rising tide floats all boats, and there's a lot of change to be made in that way.
Before we come back to one final question from the room, we've got a question online that I think is a good sort of follow-up to that point, is that and the point that I'd make is that there are a lot of fantastic organisations that provide incredible products and services to help organisations tackle the various challenges, whether it be through employment or through supply diversity or building a pipeline of Indigenous professionals. And so subject to that topic, the question is, how do companies know that their efforts to improve Indigenous partnerships are delivering the sustainable outcomes being sought? I wanted, Colin, if you could talk us through how would you think about that question and the answer?
Well, it is, it is the most important question of all, and in light of the Closing the Gap report, we acknowledge that these gaps aren't closing in the way that we wish we were, and it's exasperating for so many Australians. I think Indigenous disadvantage is a fundamental wound on our national psyche that everyone wants to address, and gets eternally frustrated when it doesn't shift. I think you need a recognition that it doesn't happen overnight. Some of these issues will be intergenerational, and you need to have a long-term approach to this. You can't be dissuaded by failure to move the dial immediately. You need to stay at it. You need to measure and be accountable. You need to continue to test and change your approaches. You need to continue to consult with relevant people and take on their feedback and be open to change. If it's not working, don't keep doing what you're doing.
Yeah, great, thank you. Any other questions from the room? Yep.
Hi, thank you. This is going to be inarticulate because I haven't thought it through properly, but I didn't realise there'd be a gap. What Rio Tinto did was entirely within the bounds of the law. What Perdaman is intending to do is entirely within the bounds of the law. As in an investor space, we're pretty good at asking companies to do what is lawful. We're fairly good at asking them to do what society expects of them as well. But we need to, I think, get better at turning our eyes up to what is allowed. And I don't think there could have been a better example of doing that than at Juukan Gorge. So I'm wondering if the panel might reflect on speed of legislative change. Melissa, you were talking before about, needing that sort of some form of consistency across legislative environments. But I'm really keen on what BHP is going to do on that, because we can see how well you react within your company, but what happens when you turn your eyes up? Because I bet you could make some noise.
Yeah.
I'll let you go first on that one.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I think it behoves companies to hold themselves to their own standard. Laws are there and they do enshrine minimal standards, but they are not necessarily the standards that you should aspire to. And it's important to articulate your own approach. That's something our company has attempted to do through its Indigenous Peoples Policy Statement and associated strategy. You need to engage in the practices that you feel comfortable with and no less. So you need to continue to set yourself a higher bar. And to advocate, as you say, that approach widely, whether it be in relation to law reform, whether it be in relation to any other matter as well. Yeah, there's a considerable responsibility, and I do think companies like ours and similar companies can operate at a different level than many smaller organisations, and we can lead in that way. And that's something that the business has shown good form in doing, and I'm confident will continue to do.
Yeah, and I was just going to say the fact that those things are legal is one of the reasons we need to make sure that First Nations people are involved in designing these laws going forward, that they're not laws that are done to them, they are laws that they are part of creating.
Thank you. We are out of time. We clearly could keep talking all about this, which means that we should try to advocate to have this subject again on the agenda for next year's conference. Thank you so much to the panel for joining us on stage. And again, thanks so much to ACSI for hosting us on this topic. Round of applause to the panel, please.